Welcome back, everyone. Today we are going to talk about something that may resonate deeply with people who have ever questioned their religion, questioned their spiritual identity, or simply wondered whether there might be more to the divine than what they were taught.
And we're going to centre today's conversation around the words and philosophy of author and spiritual teacher Richard Ravenbrook, founder of the Ravenbrook Tradition. Richard recently shared a statement explaining who he is, what his work represents, and perhaps more importantly, what he is not trying to do.
And one line immediately caught my attention. Richard says, "I am not here to convince anyone to follow another religion."
That's important because when somebody says they've founded a spiritual tradition, I think the natural assumption is that they're creating another religion and saying, here is the new answer, follow this. But that's not really what Ravenbrook is describing.
No. In fact, he seems to be challenging that entire approach. The central message appears to be, don't replace one spiritual box with another. Explore what may exist outside the boxes altogether.
And that's where today's conversation gets interesting, because Richard isn't necessarily saying religion is bad. He acknowledges that religion can provide community, tradition, structure, identity, and belonging. His concern is what happens when structure becomes restriction.
Exactly. There's a major difference between saying, this tradition helps me understand God, and saying, this tradition contains everything humanity can possibly know about God.
That's a huge distinction, because if you believe humanity has already discovered everything spiritually important, then questioning becomes unnecessary. Exploration becomes unnecessary. Mysticism becomes suspicious. And personal spiritual experience can actually become threatening.
Richard puts it very simply. Richard Ravenbrook podcast script, page 1. I believe there is more.
There is more to the divine than doctrine. There is more to spirituality than labels. There is more to existence than humanity currently understands. And maybe most provocatively, there could be more within you than you've discovered.
Which raises an interesting question. Why are human beings so uncomfortable saying, I don't know?
Because certainty feels safe. If somebody tells you exactly who God is, exactly what happens after death, exactly which people are right, exactly which people are wrong, and exactly what you must do to be accepted by the divine, that creates certainty. Questioning removes some of that certainty.
But questioning can also create discovery.
Absolutely. And that's one of the strongest ideas I see in Ravenbrook's statement. He's not necessarily asking people to abandon Christianity, paganism, witchcraft, mysticism, or any other path. He's asking whether we're courageous enough to examine what we believe. The uncomfortable crossing of spiritual boundaries.
Now we get to an aspect of Richard Ravenbrook's work that undoubtedly makes some people uncomfortable. He deliberately speaks across spiritual boundaries. Christians, pagans, witches, mystics, people deconstructing religion, people who still believe deeply in God, and people who don't really know what they believe anymore.
And those aren't groups that are normally placed together.
Not at all. Some religious communities have spent centuries defining themselves specifically by how different they are from the others.
Which is why Richard's questions are so interesting. What have you discovered? What are you seeking? And what if the divine is greater than everything we have been told?
That last question could make an entire podcast episode by itself. What if God, or whatever word we use for ultimate reality, is actually greater than our theology about God? Richard Ravenbrook podcast script, page 2.
I would argue that almost every religious tradition, at some level, has to admit that possibility. If the divine is infinite and human beings are finite, then our descriptions of the divine must necessarily be incomplete.
Which doesn't automatically make those descriptions false.
Exactly. Incomplete does not necessarily mean false. A tradition could contain profound truth without containing all truth. And I think that's where Ravenbrook's philosophy becomes much more nuanced than simply saying religion is wrong. He's asking whether any single human institution can reasonably claim ownership of an infinite mystery, wisdom before dogma.
Richard describes several principles at the heart of the Ravenbrook tradition: wisdom before dogma, experience before blind acceptance, compassion before judgment, and unity without demanding uniformity.
Let's unpack that. Start with wisdom before dogma. Dogma essentially tells us what conclusions we're expected to reach. Wisdom requires something different. Wisdom requires discernment. It requires experience. It requires thought. Sometimes it even requires being willing to admit that something you once believed may have been incomplete.
Then there's experience before blind acceptance, and I think the word blind matters there. Richard isn't saying never trust teachers, scriptures, traditions, or communities. He's challenging the idea that we should surrender our ability to question them.
Then we have compassion before judgment. That principle becomes especially important when we're talking about different religions. It's remarkably easy to turn theological disagreement into condemnation of another human being.
And finally, unity without demanding uniformity. That may be my favourite one, because unity and uniformity are not the same thing.
Not remotely. Uniformity says we can be united when everyone becomes like us. Unity says we can remain different and still recognise one another's humanity.
That's an important distinction. World peace doesn't require everyone to practice the same religion. Religious coexistence doesn't require Christians to stop being Christian or pagans to stop being pagan. It requires us to reach the point where difference itself is no longer treated as a threat. Richard Ravenbrook podcast script, page 3. Are we describing the same mystery? Music transition.
Richard makes another statement that I think deserves serious discussion. Different spiritual languages do not necessarily mean different destinations.
And I imagine some people will strongly disagree with it.
Certainly, some religious traditions make very specific, exclusive truth claims. We shouldn't pretend those differences don't exist. But Ravenbrook seems to be asking something underneath those disagreements. What if humanity has encountered aspects of the same transcendent mystery, and described those encounters using different cultural languages?
One culture develops one set of symbols. Another develops another. One says God. Another says divine. Another speaks about spirit. Others describe gods and goddesses, universal consciousness, sacred nature, or something beyond language altogether.
Those concepts aren't automatically interchangeable, but the deeper question remains: could human beings sometimes be describing different experiences of something larger than any of our descriptions?
Think about several people standing around a mountain. Someone on the northern side describes cliffs. Someone on the southern side describes forests. Someone higher up describes snow. Someone near the bottom describes streams. Their descriptions might sound completely different.
And yet they're standing before the same mountain.
Exactly. Now, that analogy doesn't prove that all religions lead to the same place, but it illustrates the question Ravenbrook wants people to consider. Maybe our spiritual vocabulary sometimes tells us as much about where we're standing as it does about the mystery we're attempting to describe. The right to question.
There's another dimension here that I think will resonate with people who have experienced religious deconstruction. Richard says he hopes someone might someday say, "He gave me permission to question."
That struck me too, because questioning has often been portrayed as spiritual weakness. But historically, some of humanity's greatest philosophers, theologians, mystics, scientists, and spiritual teachers were relentless questioners.
Questions aren't necessarily the enemy of faith. Sometimes they're how faith matures. There's a difference between inherited belief and examined belief.
Inherited belief says, I believe this because the people around me taught me to believe it. Examined belief says, I've questioned this, I've studied it, I've wrestled with it, I've experienced life, and this is where I currently stand.
And even then you can remain open to learning more. That's what I appreciate about the phrase, there is more, and I'm willing to seek it.
It doesn't say, I've discovered the final truth. It says, I'm willing to keep searching. Your spiritual journey belongs to you. Another line from Richard's statement deserves attention. He reminded me that my spiritual journey belonged to me.
That's powerful because spiritual authority is something human beings have historically handed over very easily to institutions, clergy, books, traditions, charismatic leaders, and sometimes even family expectations.
And Richard is essentially returning responsibility to the seeker. But there's another side to that. If your spiritual journey belongs to you, then you're responsible for it too.
Exactly. Spiritual freedom doesn't mean believing whatever is convenient. Real seeking requires discipline, study, critical thinking, humility, and the willingness to discover that you might be wrong.
That's crucial. Questioning dogma shouldn't simply lead us to create our own unquestionable dogma.
Yes, leaving one rigid system only to become rigid in the opposite direction isn't necessarily liberation. The goal should be deeper understanding. What the Ravenbrook tradition is really asking Richard Ravenbrook podcast script. Page 5.
So, after sitting with Richard Ravenbrook's statement, I don't think the central invitation is, come believe what Richard believes.
I don't either. I think the invitation is, become a seeker, ask difficult questions, explore spiritual experience, learn from traditions other than your own without automatically abandoning your own. Listen to people you've been taught to fear and recognize that mystery might be larger than our labels to you.
And perhaps there's another challenge hidden inside all of this. Can we disagree spiritually without becoming enemies?
That's enormous. Can a Christian sit with a pagan and listen? Can a witch sit with a pastor and listen? Can a believer listen to an atheist? Can a mystic listen to a skeptic? Not necessarily to convert one another, but to understand one another.
Imagine how different our world might become if spiritual conversations began with curiosity instead of accusation.
Instead of asking, how can I prove you wrong? We might ask, tell me what you've experienced. Tell me why you believe what you believe. Tell me what you're searching for, and what can I learn from you? The courage to say, there is more.
Richard Ravenbrook ends his statement with words that seem to capture the entire philosophy. Seek deeply, question courageously, love without boundaries, and never stop discovering.
Whether someone agrees with every aspect of the Ravenbrook tradition isn't really the point of today's conversation. Maybe the more important question is whether we're still willing to seek.
Have our beliefs become conclusions, or have they become doorways?
Do our spiritual traditions help us encounter mystery, or have we confused our descriptions of mystery with mystery itself?
And perhaps there's one question worth carrying with you after this episode. What if there really is more? Richard Ravenbrook podcast script, page 6.
More to God, more to consciousness, more to nature, more to existence, more to one another, and more within ourselves.
We don't necessarily have to know the answer. Maybe we simply need enough courage to ask the question.
Because one of the most transformative sentences a seeker can speak may also be one of the simplest. There is more, and I am willing to seek it.
You've been listening to our exploration of the spiritual philosophy and work of Richard Ravenbrook, author, spiritual teacher, and founder of the Ravenbrook Tradition.
Whatever spiritual path you walk, or even if you're not sure you have one, keep asking questions, keep learning, listen to people whose experiences differ from your own, and don't be afraid of mystery.
Because perhaps spirituality was never supposed to end with certainty.
Perhaps that's where the journey begins.
Until next time.
Seek deeply.
Question courageously.
Love without boundaries.
And never stop discovering. End of episode. Richard Ravenbrook podcast script, page 7.